Hello there, and welcome to the Gospel According to the Gospels. I'm Ben McKecken from Hope 1032 in Sydney, Australia. The Gospel of Jesus Christ, it's well known, widespread, but what is the Gospel? Can we boil it down to 25 words or less? Do you need whole chapters? Is it just one thing, Jesus, or more? From sacrifice to salvation, forgiveness to forever. And around the world, in different times and places, the gospel has actually seemed to be different or have a particular focus or emphasis, outcome. So, do you know what the gospel is? Using the 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, called the Gospels, we will together explore the gospel according to the Gospels. Each episode, a different expert will guide us through one of the Gospels or a related theme to galvanize our grip on the gospel of Jesus Christ, to inspire us to love and cling to it more and more and more. In this first episode, though, before we even get into the 4 Gospels, our way of getting into the gospel will be considering what the gospel meant before Jesus came to earth. Helping us to grasp the context and content of the gospel is Dr. Ali Robinson, lecturer of New Testament studies at United Theological College, part of Charles Sturt University in Sydney, Australia. Ali brings us up to speed about the political and regal origins of the gospel. She anchors us in the importance of the term, showing the Old and New Testaments, revealing just how vastly Jesus redefined forever what the gospel means and is. But first, let's meet Ali.
I am a New Testament lecturer. I teach New Testament for Charles Sturt University. We're part of the School of Theology, but my main thing over the last sort of 5 years has been teaching the Bible.
And how did you get into that and why?
My PhD was in that little tiny book called Jude, which is just before Revelation.
Is that the one chapter book?
Yes,
Yeah.
It's one page.
Is it maybe like 16 verses, something like
25
that? 25
verses.
Sorry,
Don't
you're the expert.
undercut it.
You're the expert.
25 verses, which is one of the reasons why I chose it, because it's nice and short. I'm dyslexic, so I find reading challenging, and I'm slow. But also because I knew that there's not a lot written on Jude, so I was like, I'm not going to tackle like Romans where I have to read like a million commentaries. So little book, and also because it's such a strange book. Like there's so many weird illustrations and allusions, and I was like, this book is so odd. Why is it in here? Why has this somehow made it into our canon? I just needed to understand it. So that's why I did it.
You are the right person for us to be talking with them, because would really like to know what the gospel means. And as we get into that, would love to know, what did the gospel mean before Jesus? If you said the word or the term, the gospel, before Jesus, what did that mean?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I think as Christians, and rightly so, we hear the word the gospel and we instantly think Jesus. And that's the point. That's what I think New Testament writers were hoping we would do. It would become...
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, I think they achieved their mission. But if we go all the way back to probably Paul was maybe the first person to really associate this quite directly to Jesus, as in the Christian gospel. But when he did that, I think he was being quite intentional in 2 ways. One, he was speaking to, I'm sure people will be very aware that he's writing within sort of this Greco-Roman world, right? And so for people who were not Jewish and they were just living and existing within this Greco-Roman world, when they heard the word gospel, either as a noun or as a verb, like I proclaim something, that's good news, they were thinking more empire, right? So
because the gospel in and of itself means good news.
Good news, that's right.
Yeah, in which language does it come from?
In Greek.
In Greek,
so,
yes.
Yeah.
Because most of the New Testament written in Greek.
That's right, yeah, written in Greek. So when they used this word in the Greco-Roman world, it was usually in association to some sort of emperor, like, good news, the new emperor's been born, or good news, like we've won this victory or this battle. So it was used in this often political sense, and it was in reference to some sort of ruler either being inaugurated or being born, or some sort of like battle victory.
So if I was living in the first century or before that,
Yeah.
but particularly before Jesus arrived,
Yeah.
I couldn't necessarily of myself use the expression the gospel. So I couldn't say breaking good news out of my life. Today I had whatever for breakfast. Like I couldn't possibly use the gospel as I'm talking to my mates, as we're working in the field or whatever it is we're doing.
Yeah, it would be very rare. Most of the manuscripts and inscriptions that we have, it's in association with someone who's important. So not that
What
you're
are you
not
saying?
important.
Thank you, Ellie. No, you're right.
But
I'm not there now and I wouldn't have been there.
It's someone who's quite important, and it's meant to have a wider impact than just, your little circle. It was meant to have an impact on the entire empire when they used this word.
Oh, so it's like a declaration of intent, or it's like a memo being sent out, or you mean it's like an official edict almost?
Yeah, that's right. So because the word was often used as a verb, it's like I'm proclaiming this good news. That's one of the things that's so interesting about the language that we have in the New Testament. Things like proclamation, salvation, peace, all these words that we think of as being associated with Jesus, which they are. Paul is actually borrowing terms, or maybe not borrowing, but like adapting these terms from his context and saying, actually, I'm going to apply them to something else, something that's even better than what you know in your context. So you've been told that the emperor can bring you peace or salvation. I'm going to tell you that actually there's someone who has a different kingdom that's of another dimension that can bring you ultimate peace, ultimate salvation. And actually, it's not just for those within the Greco-Roman Empire, it's actually for all people. So it was just like this incredible, what Paul in particular was doing, and then later the gospel writers were doing, is they're speaking in a context where these words already had a political meaning and saying, we're going to show you something even better.
Later, the gospel writers, you mean that Paul's letters were written before the
Yeah,
gospels
that's
themselves
right.
were written? Are you suggesting that they were informed by Paul's writing?
I think a lot of people think that by the time, say, Mark being the first gospel was probably written in the early 60s, we would have already had probably most of, if not all of Paul's letters, depending on, there's factors there that we won't go into. Things like, say, Galatians was probably written in like 48, so 12 years before Mark's written. So we've already got quite a lot of Paul's letters before our gospel writers actually put down what we now call the gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John.
And before we get into some of those gospels also, I was thinking about a Roman citizen thinking about or hearing the gospel from a Roman ruler. That's one thing. What about the Jewish citizens in the Roman Empire? Would they have had any different nuance at all upon the gospel, or no, it would have just been exactly what you were describing before about all Roman citizens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for people of a Jewish background, they're obviously living and working and existing within the Roman Empire. So they too have those same associations because they weren't separate from their Greco-Roman citizens. But it would have been more layered for them in that we don't really get the noun form of gospel. There's like one instance, but it's used...
Where's the instance?
It's in the Greek version of the Old Testament, and there's one instance in, I think it's 2 Kings, but the main way that it's used is actually in a verb form, again, which is like I'm proclaiming good news, and the main place we find it is in Isaiah, which is really interesting. So there's a really great New Testament scholar called Jonathan Pennington who has a book called Reading the Gospels Wisely, I think, and he has a section in there where he talks about the gospel according to Isaiah, and he looks at Isaiah 40 all the way through to 66, and we get, I think it's about 7 references to this word, gospelize, I proclaim the gospel. And he talks about how within the context for the Jewish people, they were given this prophecy from Isaiah that was meant to bring them great hope, future hope, that Yahweh was going to redeem his people. There was going to be a time when they would be rescued from this oppression that they were in because of exile and being driven into Babylon and things like that, where Yahweh was going to restore, if you think back to your biblical history, where you had, your northern kingdom went into exile, then your southern kingdom went into exile. So, there's going to be a time when all of Israel, northern and southern kingdom, were going to be brought back together. And then it goes on and says, and not just that, but you'll be a light to the nations. So there's this hint in Isaiah that Yahweh was going to bring restoration to his people. And that is called in Isaiah multiple times good news. And so I think for a Jewish audience, they would have had that in the background of their mind as well.
It's important that you raise Isaiah, and I'll get back to that. But before I do, as you're talking about the expression, the word good news, gospel, featuring in that book of prophecy that we call the Old Testament part of the Bible, that got me thinking, was the gospel then that word or expression around before the Greco-Roman world, before even ancient Israel? Like, are there other examples of it in any other cultures, any other language, as far as you know, before these times that we're seeing largely depicted in the Bible?
I know that it does get used in Homer, which is obviously we're talking 8th century BCE, so 800 years before. So as far as I'm aware, that might be one of the earliest instances. But we don't have, it's not a super common word, and it doesn't come up very often until sort of that, I want to say 300 years before Christ. So it becomes a more common term within the Greco-Roman Empire. And as I said, that section of Isaiah is probably a little bit later than the rest of Isaiah. And so, again, we're sort of pushing closer to the turn of the century.
A very notable thing about the book of Isaiah is that a lot of what you mentioned about how God will be working in his people as a light to the nations, and in terms of restoration and peace and salvation through the figure that emerges in the book of Isaiah, a Messiah figure, a suffering servant, but also Prince of Peace and Wonderful Counselor and Almighty God. That is what many people understand to be fulfilled and found in Jesus Christ, which brings us back nicely to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when we get to the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, in that, do you think we can see what the gospel of Jesus Christ is, particularly if we're thinking about the Greco-Roman backdrop? Like, what's the difference between what we were describing earlier, what you were describing? I was listening. Listen, look at me claiming ownership. My goodness me. As I was listening to you describe that, I'm also thinking, so the gospel of Jesus Christ, how different was that?
Yeah, so I think if you think about the type of figures who good news within the Greco-Roman world was associated with, so like Caesar Augustus, for instance, you've got inscriptions where we've got this good news because this emperor has been born or inaugurated, and interestingly, Caesar Augustus was also called by himself the Son of God, which is like an interesting parallel to Jesus as well.
That's an interesting thing to claim for yourself. Like,
yeah.
All right, mate.
Exactly.
Humble.
But, that's exactly right. The point is that these other figures were not humble, and there was a lot of emphasis on their power and might, authority and strength. The thing that I find so interesting about the Jesus that we get, so think about the way Mark starts his gospel. It starts with, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ.
The gospel of Jesus Christ.
The gospel of Jesus Christ, which is meant to, I think, the Son of God. He goes on, the anointed one and the Son of God. So you've got, I think from the very start, you're meant to be thinking, how is this figure meant different to, say, like a Caesar Augustus? What we then get is a very different person. Yes, he has authority. Yes, he has power over demons and sickness and
death,
and he walks on water and he can do all these incredible things. But we also get in this same person someone who's come not to be served but to serve. Someone who, even when he retreats because his best friends just died, he shows compassion. You get this very human Jesus, compassionate Jesus, kind Jesus, generous Jesus, that is incredibly different to any emperor who also used these sort of terms of Son of God and, the one who the good news is about. So I think in that way, he definitely has authority and power, but it's through his humility. And then the other thing that I find really interesting about the gospel, according to our gospel writers, so the gospel about Jesus Christ, is that ultimately, so stay with Mark's gospel for a second, we don't see the glory of God in spite of Jesus' suffering, but it's actually through Jesus' suffering, because of Jesus' suffering, because of the cross, right, that Jesus is actually glorified.
Just like Isaiah foretold many, 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 many centuries earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So, if you think about Mark, throughout Mark's gospel, there's sort of this confusion where people are like, who is this guy? Poor Peter's there going, you are the Christ. And you're like, you're right, Peter, but obviously you don't fully understand it because 2 seconds later, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And it's not until the very end when the centurion, as Jesus breathes his last breath, the centurion says, oh, truly this was the Son of God, right? Like, oh, I see now. I see now who he is through his death on the cross. And I think it's that, through weakness that we really see who Jesus is. And that I don't think there's anything comparable to that across human history.
And do you have any idea, Ali, if from the time of Jesus and his life and the sharing of the good news, the gospel about him when he was on earth and then after his ascension, I'm thinking across the first century, do you have any idea if instantaneously the word, the gospel, the expression, the gospel, the proclamation, the gospel changed? Did it instantly change at that point to become what it tends to be now, which is largely predominantly associated with Jesus Christ?
It's actually a really hard question to answer. And the reason it's a hard question to answer is because there's a great New Testament scholar called Richard Bauckham, and he talks a lot about oral tradition. And he says, if we can agree that actually they were in the first century predominantly an oral society, then what we end up getting in our written gospels is actually a reflection of what was already being shared in an oral tradition. So if that's the case, then maybe quite early on this word gospel was being associated with Jesus. But we just don't have written evidence of that, as I said, until you get to Paul, which is probably about, 15, 18 years later. So that's the first time that we see someone going, hang on a second, I think that this good news needs to be now associated with Jesus, the anointed one who's come in the line of David. Oh, that's who Isaiah was talking about. We see Paul really being the one to pull those things together and then see it being written down by the gospel writers. But what Bauckham would say is that these gospel writers are working within an oral culture, and so it's highly likely that the message was spoken. This is the good news about Jesus, that idea, well before it was written down. So my answer is probably yes, but I don't have concrete evidence for that.
Is there any concrete evidence of Roman rulers immediately starting to no longer gospel? Like, did they stop proclaiming the good news of themselves from Jesus? No. Or did that take some time? That's my presumption, but I don't have the evidence.
Not.
No. So they kept going with their gospel even as the gospel of Jesus Christ had showed up.
Yeah, definitely. Like even, so one of our later books, Revelation, we've got a new emperor at that point, probably Domitian. He's still Son of God. He's still, all those same things. So that remained quite a popular concept in the Greco-Roman Empire.
At what point do you think it changed? And again, there's a presumption under my question that it did, but I'm just thinking from our vantage point now, I don't know at what point it started trending that gospel and Jesus Christ basically went hand in hand, but it still strikes me that at some point in history, a long time ago, it largely got overtaken, if not consumed, by Jesus, that you just can't use it in any other way. But is my presumption correct?
I think your presumption is correct. And I think, we obviously have 4 Gospels in our Bible, but people may be aware that there's actually so many other Gospels that were written that didn't make it into our Bible, right? So you've got the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary. You've got so many of these other Gospels. And some of them were written probably in the 2nd century. And so that tells us that actually by then, this term, the gospel, was strongly associated with Jesus because all these other gospels sort of emerge. But they just don't make it into our Bible because they weren't copied and transmitted and circulated in the same way. So the Bible we end up with is really a result of what Christians found to be helpful. And so some of these other letters obviously didn't seem to be as helpful for early Christians.
And was it Constantine? Was that the Roman emperor, the Christian emperor who Christianized the empire? Yeah. Have you any idea if he stopped the gospel of Constantine and just went with the gospel of Jesus? Do you have any idea if he put that on the back burner and put Jesus, his gospel on the front?
Yeah. I'm definitely not an expert in that later early Christian history, but that would be my presumption, that there would have been a shift around there. I mean, obviously people do still use this word gospel in like, oh, that's the gospel truth. But I actually think that's probably, what's the word, like a hang on from, even though people might not know what they mean when they say that, I think it's still evidence of, an earlier use.
That it's more linked with the gospel of Jesus than the gospel of any other Roman emperor. Let's say that there's something, even if people don't recognize it, that gospel's been imbued with truth.
Yes, that's right.
That gospel truth is like absolute truth or ultra truth or truer than true. Yeah. That kind of meaning, which does still do the rounds now. You're right. People will still say something like the gospel truth. Do you hear any other ways that gospel is used nowadays? There's music, gospel music.
Yes.
But really, I'm struggling to think of other times where people use this expression, apart from in relation to truth, if it's not linked directly with Jesus.
I can't think of other examples other than that. I think that by maybe the 3rd or 4th century, I think it had become so strongly associated with Jesus and Christianity. I think that word at that point had been adopted so strongly into Christianity that I think it wasn't really used in other contexts anymore.
And do you think that's the same across all cultures, all places?
Yeah.
Almost since Jesus was a boy? Like it doesn't seem like it's popped up in other places, areas in the world in like the 15th century it started being used for such and such?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. It's, kind of way it almost got hijacked, by
Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
Hijacked by Jesus.
Yeah, I'm taking this for myself and, and then it sort of left everything else for dead, if you will.
It is pretty amazing, though, to discuss this and stop and think about it and recognize that, in a way, all of Jesus, and we're talking about before Jesus, and you can read through the Old Testament and see all these pointers forward to who Jesus is and was and what he would do and what he's about and what that means for us. And then throughout the New Testament, you can see more explanation and encouragement and exhortation about that. But all of that is like encapsulating the entirety of God's word into one word, gospel. Like that's quite an amazing hijacking that you are able to distill down basically everything about Jesus ever into this one word expression, the gospel. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and maybe even more than that, like saying actually what we're condensing down is, because I think I mentioned to you the other day about how Christians often think about Christianity sort of falling out of the sky a little bit, like, oh, we just open our New Testament and there's Christianity. No. It's like so interconnected with Israel's larger story, right? And so it's more than
Israel
just
as the people of God?
Israel as the people of God, God's people, Israel. So you've got this large, I want to say, salvation story that goes all the way back to the start of our Old Testament. And so what we then get is this is the ultimate fulfillment of the good news that God had always set out that he was going to fulfill. And so we've seen little, you can sort of track this good news, if you will, of God saying like, I love my people. I'm going to redeem my people. I'm going to rescue my people. There is hope. There is hope. There is hope. There is hope. And then we see that finally fulfilled in Jesus. So again, that scholar I was telling you about, Jonathan Pennington, he talks about it as Jesus being the one who breaks into the world as God incarnate, God himself, and he uses this word inaugurates, like starts the rule of God here on earth, right? And so it's what we've been waiting for. And I think sometimes as Christians, as I said, we're not always fully aware of that waiting of how Christianity fits into this larger story, salvation story of God. It was always God didn't change from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's not something that is detached from the Old Testament.
So do you think that's something that all of us, I'm particularly thinking about followers of Jesus, can take from stopping and considering the word, the gospel, and what it means? Because it's nice to have a conversation about it, and it's very interesting to hear about the history and the etymology and all these fancy words for this incredible word about Jesus. But you've just given us an example there of where that actually hits us where we live. So it's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's not just, this will make for an interesting podcast if we sit around and talk about the history of this word. Instead, we're actually talking about a word, the word, that changes people, including now. Are there any other things that you can think of that if I sit around and meditate on the gospel and what the gospel of Jesus Christ means as a word, but as a word that has hijacked the world, what else can I take from it?
I think when you think about, okay, like what is the gospel? Yeah, we've said it's this good news. Well, what is that good news? The good news is that God hasn't abandoned creation. God cares deeply for all that he has made, people and non-people, right? Like all that he has made, God cares deeply. And so the good news is that, and you see this throughout the entire Old Testament, right? There is this deep, deep brokenness. I don't think anyone can say that the world isn't broken. There's this deep, deep brokenness, but the good news is that God has actually come in flesh, put on flesh as one of us and said, I'm not going to just leave you in this mess. I have a plan, and I'm actually going to be putting the world back together, reconciling the world to myself and putting things back into their right order. And so that to me is the good news, that he doesn't leave us in this mess. As, you know, we've been talking about this word, how does it fit within the Greco-Roman Empire? How does it fit within Judaism? But it still has bearing on us today, because as we read, say, like the Old Testament, or we read the New Testament and we see the pain and the trauma and the hurt and the brokenness of the world, in a way, we're still in that because we haven't reached the end yet. We haven't got right to the full fulfillment of this.
All the good news of the good news.
The good news of the good news. The complete, you know, the Greek word is telos, the end, the perfection, you know. We haven't made that yet. We haven't made it there yet. But we can look and say, okay, we can trust that God has broken in and is putting things back together, and there will be a time when this brokenness will be eradicated.
So many thanks to Dr. Ali Robinson from United Theological College in Sydney for her guidance through what the gospel meant and means. In the next 5 episodes, we're going to get stuck into the 4 Gospels. As we head towards that, here are a couple of things out of what Ali shared that we can continue to reflect on. Does it make any difference to your response to the gospel of Jesus Christ, knowing the gospel has its roots in important leadership proclamation? What stands out to you about the ways in which Jesus redefined the gospel? And Ali said the good news of Jesus reveals God has not left us in this mess, quote unquote. How can your daily life be impacted by that truth? Be sure to join me on the next episode as David Starling, who is Vice Principal Academic at Morling Baptist College in Sydney, Australia, as David steers us through the first gospel in the New Testament, Matthew. You're going to love David's breakdown on the Matthewness of Matthew's gospel. Justice, righteousness, obedience, transform lives. And what does this gospel actually mean? You're going to find out on the next episode. Don't miss David Starling on Matthew's gospel. Before that, though, be sure to subscribe, to share the gospel according to the Gospels, and to drop us a star rating. So more and more, and even more people are able to explore together with us what exactly is the gospel of Jesus, so that all of us can be inspired to love and cling to it more. And that's right, much more. I'm Ben McKecken from Hope 1032 in Sydney, Australia. I'll see you next time.